May 18, 1943. The skies over the Solomon Islands hummed with tension as morning sunlight sliced through scattered clouds. First Lieutenant Marcus Wilson adjusted his oxygen mask and peered down at the verdant canyons of Guadalcanal from the cockpit of his P-40 Warhawk. 20,000 feet above the Pacific Theater, he was utterly alone, exactly as planned. The young airman from Tuskegee, Alabama, believed he was about to execute a routine reconnaissance mission. In less than 40 minutes, he would be fighting for his life in one of the most extraordinary aerial encounters of the entire Pacific campaign. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the untold story of how a single pilot's ingenious maneuver would not only save his life, but demonstrate how technical skill and intimate knowledge of aircraft limitations could overcome seemingly insurmountable odds, proving that sometimes victory depends not on firepower, but on the courage to attempt what others consider impossible. Lieutenant Marcus Wilson ran his fingers along the control panel of his aircraft, a ritual he performed before every mission. 26 years old, with deep brown eyes that reflected both determination and a hint of the mischief that had defined his youth back in Alabama, Wilson had already completed 15 combat missions since arriving in the Pacific 4 months earlier. He was among the first black American pilots deployed to this theater, having graduated from the Tuskegee flight program with distinction. His commanding officer, Major Thomas Hartford, had initially been skeptical, not of Wilson's abilities, but of sending a lone aircraft on reconnaissance when Japanese patrols had been increasingly active in the sector. "This is Eagle 1, commencing eastern sweep," Wilson reported through his radio. The response came back with slight static. "Roger, Eagle 1. Maintain radio contact every 30 minutes. Clear skies." It was Captain Reynolds from Base Operations. "Understood, Command. Wilson out." The mission parameters were straightforward. Photograph Japanese naval movements around the Solomon Chain, particularly near Bougainville, where intelligence suggested a buildup of enemy forces. What made the mission unusual was that Wilson was flying solo. Most reconnaissance runs employed at least 2 aircraft. But with 3 pilots down with malaria and 2 P-40 Warhawks undergoing repairs after the previous day's engagement, Wilson had volunteered for the solo mission. "I can move faster alone," he had assured Major Hartford. "Less chance of detection." What neither Wilson nor his commanders knew was that Admiral Tanaka of the Imperial Japanese Navy had ordered a fighter screen tripled around their naval operations following a surprisingly effective American bombing run 3 days earlier. 30 Mitsubishi A60s, the dreaded Zeros that had dominated much of the early air war, were patrolling in a complex pattern specifically designed to trap and eliminate American reconnaissance aircraft. Commander Hiroshi Nakamura led the Japanese squadron from his cockpit with veteran precision. At 34 years old, Nakamura had amassed an impressive record of 28 confirmed aerial victories. His pilots regarded him with mixture of awe and fear. He demanded perfection and punished failure severely. "Maintain formation discipline," Nakamura instructed his pilots in Japanese. "American reconnaissance aircraft typically arrive from the southeast. Be vigilant." Lieutenant Taro Shimizu, flying as Nakamura's wingman, was particularly eager for combat. At 22, he represented the new generation of Japanese pilots, technically skilled but with significantly less training time than earlier pilots like Nakamura, a consequence of Japan's increasingly desperate need for combat aviators. "Commander," Shimizu's voice crackled over the radio, "permission to take my section to patrol the western approach." "Negative," Nakamura replied firmly. "We maintain the assigned pattern. Patience, Lieutenant." As Wilson's P-40 continued its northeastern trajectory, he noticed unusual cloud formations developing over the distant islands. The meteorological briefing had mentioned nothing about storm systems in the area. He made a mental note to report this discrepancy upon return. Weather intelligence was critical for planning large-scale operations, and even small forecasting errors could have catastrophic consequences. Wilson checked his altitude, 21,000 feet. Perfect for his mission, though he knew his aircraft performed better at lower altitudes compared to the Zero, which struggled in the thinner air above 20,000 feet. This was one of the few advantages the P-40 held over its Japanese counterpart, a fact Wilson had memorized from countless briefings and personal experience. Reaching for his canteen, Wilson took a quick sip of lukewarm water. The cockpit was heating up despite the high altitude, another notorious characteristic of the P-40. Pilots jokingly called it the flying greenhouse due to its extensive canopy glass. Wilson had modified his personal aircraft with additional ventilation flaps, an unauthorized adjustment that his mechanics had agreed to install after he had helped them repair a damaged landing gear assembly during off-duty hours. At the 9,000-foot level, approximately 12 miles east of Wilson's position, Lieutenant Junior Grade Kenji Okada was the first Japanese pilot to notice the distinctive silhouette of an American aircraft. Potential contact, bearing 270, high altitude, Okada reported calmly. Commander Nakamura immediately ordered radio silence and signaled for the squadron to climb to interception altitude. They would approach from below and behind, the deadliest position against a P-40, whose rear visibility was notoriously poor. Wilson completed his photographic run of the northern coastline of Bougainville and banked his aircraft gently to the west. Through his polarized goggles, he could make out what appeared to be naval vessels, at least 3 destroyer-sized ships in the distant harbor. He activated his reconnaissance camera, which was mounted beneath the fuselage. Eagle 1 to command. Completing primary objective. Have visual on 3. Correction, 4 naval vessels at designated Point Baker. Beginning photographic series now. The radio returned only static. Wilson frowned and adjusted the frequency. Eagle 1 to command, radio check. More static, but this time with a faint pattern to it, a rhythmic interference that pilots had learned to recognize as an indication of Japanese radio jamming. Wilson's pulse quickened. Jamming typically meant one thing: enemy aircraft in the vicinity. He quickly scanned the sky, methodically checking each sector as he'd been trained. Nothing visible yet, but that meant little. The sun's position would make aircraft approaching from the east nearly invisible until they were dangerously close. Wilson made a split-second decision. Rather than turning back toward base, the obvious and expected move, he would continue westward, deeper into Japanese territory, then swing south through the mountainous central region of Bougainville. It was a longer route home, but the terrain might provide cover if he needed to evade pursuit. 15 miles behind Wilson's aircraft, Commander Nakamura had organized his 30 Zeros into 3 hunting groups. The main force of 18 aircraft would pursue directly. A second group of 8 would swing south to cut off the expected retreat route. The remaining 4 would climb to 25,000 feet to maintain the highest observation position. "He has spotted us," Nakamura announced to his pilots. "He has changed course to the west instead of retreating." "Interesting." Lieutenant Shimizu's voice betrayed his excitement. "He is flying into our territory, a foolish decision." "Perhaps," Nakamura replied, "or perhaps he knows something we do not. Maintain formation and close distance gradually. No precipitous actions." Wilson, meanwhile, had spotted the first group of Japanese fighters, tiny black specks against the cloud layer, but unmistakably aircraft, and moving with purpose. His trained eye could distinguish the distinctive wing profile of the Zero, even at this distance. A cold weight settled in his stomach. There were too many to count at a glance, but certainly more than his P-40 could hope to outfight. "This is Eagle 1, Wilson transmitted, knowing that even through jamming, brief transmissions might get through. "Am encountering heavy enemy presence, multiple bandits, estimate squadron strength, and proceeding to alternate Route Delta." Route Delta didn't exist. It was Wilson's impromptu code to indicate he was creating his own escape route, and would attempt to evade rather than return directly. Wilson pushed his throttle forward and began a shallow dive to build speed. The P-40 responded with a satisfying surge of acceleration. While outmatched by the Zero in several performance categories, the American fighter held 2 critical advantages. It could dive faster, and it was significantly more durable. Wilson intended to exploit both facts. The first Japanese fighters had spotted Wilson's dive and moved to intercept. Nakamura, observing the Americans' maneuver, recognized the tactic. "He will attempt to use his diving speed. the commander informed his pilots. Group 3. Reposition to the southwest. He will emerge from his dive in that direction. Wilson leveled off at 12,000 feet, his airspeed indicator showing 380 miles per hour, near the maximum the P-40's frame could safely handle. Below him, the tropical landscape of Bougainville spread out in a patchwork of deep green jungle and black volcanic rock. And directly ahead lay his best hope for survival, a deep, winding canyon that cut through the Central Highlands. Known to American pilots as the Serpent, this geological formation had been the site of several aerial engagements earlier in the campaign. Its narrow walls and unpredictable wind patterns made it hazardous to navigate, but Wilson had flown through it twice before during combat operations. More importantly, he had studied topographical maps of the region obsessively during his off-duty hours, a habit that had earned him gentle mockery from fellow pilots, but had given him intimate knowledge of the terrain. The canyon stretched for approximately 8 miles, with multiple sharp turns and vertical rock faces rising over 1,000 feet from the valley floor in some sections. A river snaked along its bottom, providing a reflective surface that could be both a navigational aid and a disorienting hazard, depending on sun position. Wilson checked his mirrors again. The Japanese fighters were closing rapidly, their formation spreading out to prevent his escape. He counted at least 20 aircraft, an overwhelming force. His hands were steady on the controls, but sweat trickled down his back despite the cockpit's ventilation. Eagle 1 continuing evasive route, he transmitted, doubting anyone could hear through the jamming. If you're receiving, be advised I am heading into the Serpent Canyon system. We'll attempt to reach secondary extraction point. The secondary extraction point was a small Allied airfield on the southern coast, used primarily for emergency landings. If he could reach it, Wilson might find sanctuary, or at least additional aircraft to even the odds. The first bullets streaked past his canopy, luminous tracers that indicated the Japanese fighters were now within effective firing range. Wilson responded with a series of rolling turns, a technique that made his aircraft momentarily unpredictable while maintaining his forward progress. The entrance to the Serpent loomed ahead, a dark gash in the otherwise unbroken green of the jungle. Wilson aligned his aircraft with the canyon mouth and prepared for the most dangerous flying of his career. Commander Nakamura observed the American pilot's trajectory with growing concern. "He is entering the canyon system," he announced to his squadron. "This requires precision flying. First squadron will follow directly. Second squadron, proceed to the canyon exit and establish blocking positions. Third squadron, maintain high cover." Lieutenant Shimizu's voice betrayed his eagerness. "Commander, request permission to lead pursuit into the canyon." Nakamura considered briefly. Shimizu was among his most technically skilled pilots, though sometimes recklessly aggressive. "Permission granted. Take 3 aircraft only. The canyon cannot accommodate our full squadron safely." Wilson's P-40 roared into the canyon entrance, its wings nearly parallel to the vertical rock walls. Immediately, he had to bank sharply to navigate the first bend, a nearly 90-degree turn that tested both aircraft and pilot to their limits. The G-forces pressed him hard against his seat as the canyon walls blurred past his canopy. The Japanese pilots followed, with Lieutenant Shimizu in the lead. Their Zeros, lighter and more maneuverable than Wilson's P-40, initially handled the canyon's tight confines with impressive agility. "Maintain separation," Shimizu ordered his 3 wingmen. "Taniguchi remain highest. Watanabe and Ozawa stagger your positions." The 4 Japanese fighters entered the canyon in a loose formation, their pilots confident in their superior aircraft and their own abilities. What they didn't fully appreciate was the difference in experience, not just as pilots, but specifically in this canyon. While they were encountering these conditions for the first time, Wilson had flown through this formation before and had studied its every contour. The canyon narrowed as Wilson approached the second major turn, this one even tighter than the first. His airspeed indicator showed 320 miles per hour, dangerously fast for the confined space. The standard procedure would be to reduce speed significantly before attempting such a turn. Instead, Wilson did something that would later become legendary among Allied pilots. He rolled his aircraft inverted, pulled back on the stick, and completed the turn upside down. This maneuver, An inverted negative G turn allowed him to maintain speed while changing direction in a tighter radius than would otherwise be possible. It also placed enormous strain on both the aircraft and pilot. Blood rushed to his head as the negative G forces took effect, and his vision began to narrow with the early effects of a redout, the opposite of the blackout pilots experienced under positive G forces. Behind him, Lieutenant Shimizu witnessed Wilson's inverted turn with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "He flies with great skill," Shimizu noted to his wingman. "Follow precisely, but maintain your spacing." Pilot Officer Watanabe, the least experienced of the four, responded with concern. "The turn is too tight for our speed, Lieutenant." "Reduce throttle and follow," Shimizu commanded, already banking his zero into the turn. What followed would later be described in an intelligence debriefing as a cascade of errors triggered by a single brilliant tactical innovation. As Shimizu attempted to follow Wilson through the inverted turn, his zero, optimized for positive G maneuvers, began to experience fuel delivery problems. The Japanese aircraft's carburetor system was not designed for sustained inverted flight, particularly at high speed through turbulent canyon air. Shimizu's engine sputtered momentarily, causing a split-second loss of power at the most critical phase of the turn. His Zero's wingtip struck the canyon wall, a glancing blow but sufficient to send the fighter into an unrecoverable spin within the narrow confines of the canyon. His aircraft impacted the canyon floor in a bright flash visible to the pilots behind him. Pilot Officer Watanabe, following closely, made a critical error in response to witnessing his leader's crash. Instead of maintaining his assigned position, he instinctively pulled up, directly into the path of Taniguchi's Zero. The two aircraft collided, sending fragments ricocheting off the canyon walls. The fourth pilot, Ozawa, managed to avoid the immediate catastrophe, but found himself too fast and too close to the approaching turn. His attempt to brake mid-air by rapidly reducing throttle and deploying flaps created precisely the wrong aerodynamic configuration for the turbulent canyon conditions. His Zero stalled, dropped its right wing, and careened into the rock face. In less than 15 seconds, all four pursuing Japanese fighters had been eliminated without Wilson firing a single shot. Commander Nakamura, monitoring from above the canyon, received the shocking news from his observation squadron. "All aircraft in First Pursuit Group are lost," came the report. "The American executed an inverted turn that our pilots could not match in these conditions." Nakamura's response was immediate. "All aircraft maintain position, do not enter the canyon. We will intercept the American when he emerges." Wilson, unaware of the full extent of the devastation behind him, continued his high-speed navigation through the canyon. His breathing was controlled, but labored as he fought against the physical strains of the extreme maneuvers. The next section of the canyon featured a series of smaller, less acute turns that allowed him to temporarily roll back to normal orientation and relieve the pressure on his circulatory system. He checked his fuel gauge. The high-speed evasion was consuming petroleum at an alarming rate. At current usage, he would have approximately 30 minutes of flight time remaining upon exiting the canyon, enough to reach the secondary airfield, but with little margin for error. Wilson approached what pilots called the chimney, a section where the canyon briefly narrowed to less than 100 yards across, with sheer vertical walls rising over 1,200 feet. The space was barely twice the wingspan of his P-40, leaving no room for banking. The standard approach was to reduce speed significantly and center the aircraft precisely. Instead, Wilson executed another unconventional maneuver. He rolled his P-40 90 degrees to the left, orienting his wings vertically rather than horizontally. In this knife-edge position, he was able to navigate the narrow passage at high speed, using subtle rudder inputs to maintain his course. It was a technique he had practiced precisely once before, during a training exercise back in Alabama, earning him a formal reprimand for unnecessary risk-taking and aircraft endangerment. That reprimand had been delivered by Captain Harrison Wells, his flight instructor, who had nevertheless pulled Wilson aside afterward. "That was the stupidest, most reckless thing I've ever seen," Wells had told him privately, "and someday it might save your life. Just make sure the situation warrants the risk." Today, the situation unquestionably warranted the risk. Commander Nakamura had repositioned his remaining 26 aircraft to intercept Wilson at the canyon exit. 8 Zeros waited at the south end where the canyon opened into a wide valley. Another 12 were positioned at higher altitude to prevent vertical escape, while 6 maintained position to the west to cut off any attempt to change direction after emerging. "He cannot escape," Nakamura assured his pilots. "When he exits the confined space, we will converge from multiple vectors. No single aircraft is to engage alone." Wilson was now 3/4 of the way through the canyon system. His map knowledge told him the most difficult sections were behind him, but the final stretch still presented significant challenges. The canyon began to widen slightly, allowing him to roll back to level flight and assess his situation. The reduced compression between the canyon walls created new aerodynamic conditions, specifically unpredictable updrafts that could suddenly lift an aircraft several hundred feet. Wilson had witnessed another pilot, Captain Michael Donovan, lose control in this section 2 months earlier when an updraft had caught his P-38 Lightning during a routine patrol. Donovan had survived, but fractured 3 vertebrae when his aircraft struck the upper canyon wall. Now Wilson deliberately positioned his P-40 slightly lower than center in the canyon to allow room for sudden upward displacement. The precaution proved prescient. As he navigated the penultimate turn, his aircraft suddenly lurched upward, carried by a powerful thermal column. Rather than fighting the natural force, Wilson momentarily reduced throttle and used the updraft to gain altitude within the widening canyon, positioning himself higher as the walls fell away, which would give him a crucial energy advantage when facing whatever awaited him outside. Wilson couldn't know the extent of the Japanese formation waiting for him, but he had no illusions about his situation. A single P-40, even piloted by the most skilled aviator, could not hope to defeat multiple Zeros in a conventional engagement. His only chance was to use surprise and momentum to break through their formation and make a run for Allied territory. As the canyon walls fell away on either side, Wilson saw exactly what he had feared. The sky ahead was dotted with Japanese fighters, positioned in a classic containment pattern. He counted at least 15 visible aircraft, with likely more beyond his immediate field of vision. In the standard fighter pilot playbook, this was a hopeless scenario. Wilson had seconds to make a decision that would determine whether he lived or died, whether his reconnaissance photographs would reach Allied intelligence, and whether 30 more American airmen would fly into a Japanese trap the following day. What Wilson did next would later be included in United States Army Air Force's training manuals as an example of tactical improvisation under extreme duress. Rather than attempting to climb, dive, or turn away from the waiting Japanese aircraft, all expected reactions that Nakamura's formation was positioned to counter, Wilson maintained his course directly toward the center of their formation. Then, at a distance of approximately 1,000 yards, he executed a maneuver that combined elements of a barrel roll with a hammerhead stall. The P-40 spiraled upward in a corkscrew pattern, bleeding airspeed rapidly until it briefly hung motionless at the apex of the climb. In this suspended moment, Wilson's aircraft was pointed nearly straight up, presenting a minimal target profile to the Japanese fighters. Then, as gravity reclaimed the temporarily stationary aircraft, Wilson used rudder control to pivot the nose through 180 degrees, pointing directly back toward the canyon he had just exited. Commander Nakamura, watching from 5,000 feet above, immediately recognized the danger. "He is returning to the canyon. All units converge," he ordered. The Japanese formation, designed to prevent escape toward Allied territory, was momentarily confused by the Americans' reversal. Several pilots adjusted course too aggressively, their formation discipline momentarily breaking down as they attempted to reposition. 2 Zeros, piloted by Lieutenant Junior Grade Matsuda and Ensign Konda, collided in the confusion, their wingtips connecting with sufficient force to send Matsuda's fighter into an uncontrolled spin while Konda struggled to maintain level flight with a damaged aileron. Wilson's P-40, now diving back toward the canyon entrance with gravity, adding to its acceleration, reached a speed of nearly 400 miles per hour, well beyond what the Japanese fighters could match in pursuit. He streaked past 3 Zeros that had moved to block his return. the Japanese pilots unable to adjust their position quickly enough to bring their weapons to bear. Lieutenant Yasuhiro Komaki, positioned slightly apart from the main formation, managed to achieve a brief firing position. His 20mm cannon rounds streaked past Wilson's cockpit, one round striking the P-40's right wing, punching a clean hole through the metal but missing any critical control surfaces or fuel tanks. Wilson reached the canyon entrance and did not hesitate. He plunged back into the narrow confines at a speed that most pilots would consider suicidal, knowing that his pursuers would face the same hazardous conditions that had claimed their comrades earlier. Commander Nakamura made an immediate tactical decision. "Do not follow into the canyon," he ordered. "Reposition to all exit points. He cannot remain in there indefinitely." What Nakamura couldn't know was that Wilson had no intention of navigating the entire canyon again. Approximately 1 mile into the system, a smaller tributary canyon branched off to the west, a feature clearly marked on Wilson's memorized maps, but considered inaccessible to aircraft due to its extremely narrow width. Known as the Needle among the few American pilots aware of its existence, this subsidiary canyon was barely 70 feet across at its widest point, less than the wingspan of larger aircraft like bombers or transport planes. For a single-engine fighter like the P-40, it represented a theoretical passage, though no pilot had been documented successfully navigating its entire length. Wilson banked his aircraft sharply and aligned with the nearly invisible entrance to the Needle. From the air, the narrow slot was barely perceptible, appearing as little more than a shadow between towering rock faces. Without precise knowledge of its location, it would be nearly impossible to identify its speed. The transition from the main canyon to the Needle required a nearly instantaneous reduction in speed and an extremely precise alignment. Wilson cut his throttle and deployed flaps momentarily, dropping his airspeed from 370 to 240 miles per hour in seconds, a deceleration that pressed him hard against his harness. The P-40's wingtips cleared the canyon walls by less than 10 feet on either side as he entered the Needle. Inside this extremely confined space, even minor turbulence could prove fatal, sending the aircraft into walls that seemed close enough to touch from the cockpit. The Needle traced a relatively straight path westward for approximately 3 miles before turning south. This orientation was crucial to Wilson's emerging plan. The Japanese formation would be expecting him to exit the main canyon, either at its southern end or back at the northern entrance. By taking this nearly unknown side passage, he might emerge from an entirely unexpected direction. Wilson maintained absolute concentration, his hands making minute adjustments to the controls as the P-40 threaded through the narrow passage. The straight section of the Needle gave way to a gentle curve that required constant correction to navigate. His ground speed had dropped to 190 miles per hour, the minimum he could safely maintain without risking a stall in the turbulent air. Outside the canyon system, Commander Nakamura was systematically positioning his remaining forces to ensure the American could not escape. 18 Zeros now covered the southern exit of the main canyon, while 8 guarded the northern entrance through which Wilson had just disappeared. The remaining pilots who had lost formation during the earlier confusion were regrouping at higher altitude. "Status report from all sections," Nakamura commanded. "South exit covered, no sign of the American," reported Lieutenant Commander Yukio Sato. "North entrance secured," confirmed Lieutenant Iwamoto. "No activity since his re-entry." Nakamura considered the situation with growing concern. The American pilot had displayed exceptional skill and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. The longer he remained unaccounted for, the greater the possibility he had found some unexpected means of escape, or perhaps had been forced down inside the canyon itself. "Lieutenant Iwamoto, send 2 aircraft to survey the canyon from above," Nakamura ordered. "Maintain safe altitude and report any sign of a crash or the American aircraft." Within the Needle, Wilson was approaching the final and most challenging section of the passage. The canyon narrowed even further and descended rapidly, dropping nearly 500 feet over a distance of less than 1 mile. This required a controlled dive within an extremely confined space, a maneuver that demanded perfect coordination between throttle, elevators, and rudder. Wilson's P-40 accelerated with the descent, forcing him to apply periodic bursts of flaps to maintain a manageable speed. The turbulence increased as he descended, the aircraft buffeting violently as conflicting air currents collided in the compressed space. A particularly strong gust caught his left wing, momentarily pushing the P-40 dangerously close to the eastern wall. Wilson countered with rudder and aileron input, his corrections so immediate they seemed more instinct than conscious action. His wingtip passed within feet of the jagged rock surface, close enough that the downdraft from his propeller sent small pebbles scattering from protruding ledges. After what seemed an eternity but was actually less than 4 minutes, Wilson glimpsed the exit of the Needle, a widening gap that opened onto the western coastal plains of Bougainville. According to his mental map, this position would place him approximately 20 miles northwest of the Japanese formation, guarding the main canyon exits and roughly 60 miles from the secondary Allied airfield. Wilson emerged from the Needle at 140 feet above the valley floor, immediately banking southward and accelerating to build altitude gradually. Rather than climbing rapidly, which would make him visible at greater distance, he maintained a low profile, using terrain features to mask his trajectory as he had been trained during low-altitude infiltration exercises. 2 Japanese Zeros were visible far to the southeast, circling at approximately 5,000 feet above the main canyon exit. From their position and altitude, they had no chance of spotting Wilson's P-40 as it skimmed the treetops more than 15 miles away. For the first time since encountering the Japanese formation, Wilson allowed himself a moment of cautious optimism. He had survived the most immediate danger through a combination of skill, knowledge, and calculated risk. Now he faced a different challenge, reaching friendly territory with limited fuel and a damaged aircraft. The single cannon round that had pierced his right wing had compromised the aerodynamic integrity of the structure. At his current speed, the aircraft pulled slightly to the right, requiring constant left aileron pressure to maintain straight flight. This asymmetric drag increased fuel consumption and would make precision landing more challenging. Wilson checked his fuel gauge, 18% remaining. Sufficient for approximately 40 minutes of economical cruising flight, enough to reach the secondary airfield if he maintained optimal speed and altitude. He set his course and prepared for the final leg of his journey. Meanwhile, Commander Nakamura was growing increasingly frustrated with the disappearance of the American aircraft. "He cannot have simply vanished," he told his squadron leaders. "Expand the search pattern. All aircraft maintain fuel awareness." The Japanese had been airborne for nearly 2 hours, approaching the operational limit of the Zero's range when maintaining combat readiness. Several pilots were already below 30% fuel reserves, which would necessitate their return to base within the hour. Nakamura faced a difficult decision: maintain the search with increasingly fuel-depleted aircraft, or withdraw to regroup and refuel. The Admiral's orders had been explicit: prevent American reconnaissance of naval operations at all costs. Failure would reflect poorly not just on Nakamura, but potentially impact the entire naval strategy in the region. Lieutenant Commander Sato, maintain position at the southern exit with 10 aircraft, Nakamura finally ordered. Lieutenant Iwamoto, continue north coverage with 6. The remaining aircraft will conduct a spiral search pattern, expanding from the canyon system. Nakamura himself would lead this search group, a decision that demonstrated the seriousness with which he viewed the situation. An American reconnaissance aircraft, returning with photographs of Japanese naval deployments, could compromise operations representing months of planning and thousands of lives. Wilson continued his southward journey, alternating between extremely low-altitude flight when over jungle-covered terrain and slightly higher profiles when crossing clearings or rivers that offered less concealment. His navigation remained precise despite the absence of radio guidance, relying on visual landmarks and his detailed knowledge of Bougainville's geography. 30 minutes after emerging from the Needle, Wilson spotted a thin column of smoke rising from beyond a nearby ridge, a potential indication of human activity that warranted investigation. Banking slightly eastward, he approached the ridge at minimum speed to reduce engine noise, then rose just high enough to see over the natural barrier. On the other side, a scene of destruction greeted him. A Japanese supply depot had been the target of an American bombing run, likely within the past day. Several structures were still smoldering, and he could make out the forms of Japanese personnel attempting to salvage materials from the wreckage. Wilson immediately ducked back below the ridgeline before he could be spotted. This discovery presented both opportunity and risk. The Japanese would certainly have communications equipment at such a facility, meaning they could potentially alert nearby forces to his presence. Conversely, the recent bombing suggested that American forces were active in this region, possibly operating from the very airfield he was attempting to reach. Wilson adjusted his course slightly eastward, giving the Japanese position a wide berth while maintaining his southerly heading. His fuel situation was becoming increasingly critical, the gauge now indicating 11% remaining, perhaps 30 minutes of flight at current consumption rates. The secondary Allied airfield, designated Outpost Victor, should be appearing on the horizon within the next 15 minutes if his navigation remained accurate. Wilson began a gradual climb to 3,000 feet to improve his visual range, accepting the increased visibility to Japanese observers as a necessary risk given his fuel constraints. As Wilson gained altitude, the full scope of Bougainville's southern coastline came into view, a stunning panorama of volcanic black sand beaches transitioning to the deep blue of the Solomon Sea. Under different circumstances, the beauty might have been worthy of contemplation. Today, Wilson scanned the landscape with singular focus, searching for the distinctive pattern of a prepared airfield. 10 miles ahead, a rectangular clearing in the otherwise unbroken jungle canopy signaled human intervention. As Wilson drew closer, the outline of a crude runway became visible. A flattened strip approximately 4,000 feet long with several dispersal areas for aircraft concealment. This was Outpost Victor, established 3 months earlier as an emergency forward operating location for Allied aircraft. Its existence was known only to pilots operating in the immediate region, and it was not marked on standard navigation charts, a security measure to prevent Japanese targeting. Wilson reduced altitude and prepared for landing approach. The field had no control tower or radio guidance, relying instead on visual wind indicators and pilot judgment. A crude windsock, fashioned from what appeared to be a repurposed parachute panel, indicated a slight crosswind from the east. As he aligned for final approach, Wilson noticed movement at the field's edge, personnel emerging from camouflaged positions to observe his arrival. Standard procedure at these forward locations included ground observers, ready to provide recognition signals to approaching aircraft and, if necessary, emergency anti-aircraft defense against enemy incursions. Wilson rocked his wings in the recognition pattern of the day, 3 distinct left-right oscillations, followed by a brief wings level period, and then 2 additional rocks. The signal identified him as a friendly aircraft without requiring radio communication that might be intercepted. From the ground, a yellow smoke signal confirmed reception and cleared him for landing. Wilson lowered his landing gear and reduced speed further, compensating for the right-wing drag caused by the cannon damage. The final approach would be particularly challenging with this asymmetric handling characteristic. The P-40 touched down with a brief screech of rubber against the packed earth runway, bounced slightly, then settled into a rapidly decelerating roll. Wilson applied brakes judiciously, mindful of the unimproved surface that could easily cause a skid or nose-over if handled roughly. As the aircraft rolled to a stop near the eastern dispersal area, Wilson saw ground crew running toward him, 4 mechanics and what appeared to be an intelligence officer based on his uniform. Wilson completed shutdown procedures, his hands moving through the familiar sequence automatically, while his mind began processing the extraordinary events of the past 2 hours. The canopy slid back with a mechanical clunk, and Wilson removed his oxygen mask, the humid tropical air rushing in to replace the dry, filtered atmosphere of the cockpit. He unplugged his radio connection and intercom, removed his helmet, and stood carefully in the cockpit, his legs momentarily unsteady after the prolonged high-stress flying. "Lieutenant Wilson," the intelligence officer called up, shielding his eyes against the midday sun. "I'm Captain Lewis, Field Intelligence. We weren't expecting any incoming aircraft today." Wilson nodded, fatigue suddenly washing over him as the adrenaline began to subside. "Emergency diversion, sir. I've got reconnaissance photos of Japanese naval deployments near Bougainville, and one hell of a story to go with them." He climbed down from the aircraft, his flight suit dark with sweat. One of the mechanics was already examining the cannon hole in the right wing, whistling softly at the clean puncture through the metal. "You're going to want to get those photographs developed immediately, Captain," Wilson continued, retrieving his sidearm and survival pack from the cockpit. "And I need to report directly to command about Japanese fighter coverage in the region. They've substantially increased their patrols, at least 30 Zeros covering the central sector." Captain Lewis's eyebrows rose. 30? That's an entire squadron plus reinforcements. How did you manage to evade that kind of force? Wilson glanced back at his aircraft, the P-40 already being wheeled toward a camouflaged revetment by the ground crew. "Let's just say I found a shortcut they weren't expecting," he replied, too exhausted to begin the full explanation. "But we need to warn any other reconnaissance missions immediately. No single aircraft should be operating in that airspace until we understand their new patrol patterns." As Wilson walked with Captain Lewis toward the operations bunker, the events of the past 2 hours began to take on a dreamlike quality. The canyon flight, the inverted maneuvers, the desperate escape through the needle. Each segment seemed almost impossibly remote now that his boots were on solid ground. What Wilson couldn't know was that his shortcut had already become the subject of confusion and disbelief among the Japanese forces still searching for him. 2 Japanese reconnaissance aircraft dispatched to survey the canyon from above had reported the wreckage of 4 Zeros scattered along the canyon floor, with no sign of the American P-40 or any other crashed aircraft. Commander Nakamura circled high above the canyon system, his frustration mounting as the search for the American reconnaissance plane entered its 3rd hour. His squadron had now split into smaller search groups, methodically combing the terrain below for any sign of the elusive P-40 or its pilot. "Commander, fuel reserves are at critical levels," reported Lieutenant Iwamoto. "Several aircraft are below 15%. Nakamura checked his own gauge, 17% remaining. The decision could no longer be delayed. "All aircraft, return to base," he ordered finally. "Maintain observation during return flight. Report any sightings immediately." As the Japanese fighters reluctantly turned northward toward their base, Nakamura struggled with the implications of their failure. How would he explain that 30 of Japan's finest pilots had been outmaneuvered by a single American aircraft? Worse still, how could he justify the loss of 4 skilled airmen and their valuable Zeros without even confirming the destruction of their target? At Outpost Victor, Lieutenant Marcus Wilson sat in a crude briefing room, a cup of strong black coffee warming his hands as he detailed his encounter to an increasingly astonished group of officers. "The canyon system has 3 main passages," Wilson explained, sketching a rough map on a sheet of paper. "The main channel that we've all flown through before, the chimney section that narrows to about 100 yards across, and this 3rd passage here." He indicated a thin line branching westward, which the locals call the Needle. Captain Lewis studied the drawing with interest. "I've heard rumors about that passage, but intelligence classified it as inaccessible to aircraft." "It very nearly is," Wilson admitted. 70 feet across at its widest point. My wingspan is 37 feet, not much room for error." Major Samuel Peterson, the senior officer present, shook his head in disbelief. "And you flew through this, upside down?" "Only through the main canyon's tightest turn," Wilson clarified. "It was the only way to maintain speed while changing direction in that confined space. The Zero can outmaneuver us in level flight, but they're not designed for inverted negative G maneuvers, especially at high speed." "And your pursuers attempted to follow?" Peterson asked. Wilson nodded solemnly. 4 of them entered the canyon behind me. None made it through that turn. Their aircraft aren't built for that kind of flying, and from what I could tell, they didn't have the canyon memorized like I did." The intelligence officer, Captain Lewis, had been taking detailed notes throughout Wilson's account. "This information about their patrol patterns is extremely valuable, Lieutenant. 30 Zeros committed to a single sector represents a significant commitment of their air resources, which suggests they're protecting something important," Major Peterson concluded. "Your reconnaissance photographs might show us exactly what." As if on cue, a communications officer entered the briefing room with an envelope. "Sir, preliminary development of Lieutenant Wilson's reconnaissance photographs as requested." Major Peterson opened the envelope and spread the photographs across the table. Despite the hasty development process, the images clearly showed what appeared to be a substantial Japanese naval presence. At least 2 cruisers and several destroyer-class vessels gathered in a protected harbor. "This confirms our suspicions," Peterson said quietly. "They're assembling a naval force for operations against our positions on Guadalcanal. These photographs alone justify your mission, Lieutenant, quite apart from the intelligence value of your encounter with their air patrols." Wilson studied the photographs with professional interest, recognizing the strategic significance of what he'd captured. Yet a question nagged at him. "Sir, why would they commit their entire fighter strength to patrol a single sector? Even with these naval assets, it seems excessive." Captain Lewis exchanged glances with Major Peterson before responding. "We've been tracking increased Japanese transport activity throughout the region. Intelligence suggests they may be bringing in a new weapon system, possibly enhanced aircraft or naval assets. Your photographs may have captured the first confirmation of these reports." The briefing continued for another hour as Wilson provided additional details about Japanese aircraft positions, patrol patterns, and the canyon system's unique features. By the time they finished, the sun was setting over Bougainville, casting long shadows across the airfield. "Get some rest, Lieutenant," Major Peterson advised. "We'll have a transport aircraft ready at 0600 tomorrow to take you and these photographs back to Guadalcanal headquarters. Admiral Halsey's staff will want your first-hand account." Wilson nodded, the accumulated fatigue of the day's events finally catching up to him. As he stood to leave, Peterson added, "What you accomplished today was extraordinary, Wilson. That kind of flying. I've never seen anything like it in my 20 years of service." "Thank you, sir," Wilson replied simply. "I just did what was necessary to complete the mission." As Wilson exited the operations bunker, the tropical night enveloped him in its humid embrace. Stars were appearing in the eastern sky, countless points of light against the deepening blue. The distant rumble of naval artillery from somewhere along the coast served as a reminder that the war continued unabated, regardless of individual triumphs or tragedies. One of the airfield's mechanics, Technical Sergeant Frank Mullins, approached as Wilson made his way toward the temporary quarters. "Lieutenant," Mullins called out, "I just finished looking over your aircraft. Thought you might want to know what I found." Wilson paused. "Anything serious beyond the cannon damage to the wing?" Mullins shook his head, a look of professional admiration on his weathered face. "That's just it, sir. Besides that clean hole in your starboard wing, your aircraft is in remarkably good condition considering what you put it through. But I did find something interesting. Stress fractures in the wing roots. Very fine, barely visible. Another few minutes of those high-G maneuvers, and you might have experienced catastrophic structural failure." The mechanic's clinical description sent a chill through Wilson, despite the tropical heat. "How long to repair?" "Under normal circumstances, I'd ground this aircraft for complete wing spar replacement," Mullins replied. "But out here, we'll reinforce what we can. She'll fly tomorrow, but I wouldn't recommend any more canyon acrobatics." Wilson nodded, grateful for the mechanic's candor. "She got me home, Sergeant. That's what matters." "Indeed it did, sir," Mullins agreed. "We're installing additional armor plating behind the pilot's seat while we're at it. Captain Lewis's orders." Wilson thanked the mechanic and continued toward the temporary barracks. Little more than a prefabricated structure with canvas partitions separating crude bunks. As he walked, his thoughts turned to his fellow pilots back at the main base on Guadalcanal. How many of them would be assigned similar reconnaissance missions in the coming days? How many would encounter the same heightened Japanese patrols? The knowledge he'd gained today about Japanese patrol patterns, aircraft limitations, and the viable escape route through the Needle could mean the difference between life and death for his colleagues. Getting this intelligence back to headquarters had become even more critical than he'd initially realized. In his Spartan quarters, Wilson found a basin of water had been prepared for washing, along with a clean uniform laid out on the bunk, small comforts that suddenly seemed luxurious after the day's events. He removed his sweat-soaked flight suit and washed away the grime of combat, his muscles protesting every movement after the sustained strain of the canyon flight. As he dressed in the fresh uniform, Wilson noticed his hands were perfectly steady, no trace of the tremors that many pilots experienced after intense combat situations. His instructors at Tuskegee had always commented on his unusual calm under pressure, a natural trait that had served him well today. A mess attendant appeared at the partition entrance. "Lieutenant Wilson, Major Peterson thought you might appreciate a meal brought to your quarters, sir." The attendant placed a tray on the small field desk, a plate of hot food, some kind of meat stew with rice, alongside bread and a canteen cup of coffee. Wilson hadn't realized how hungry he was until that moment. "Please thank the Major for me," Wilson replied. "This is most welcome." After the attendant departed, Wilson ate mechanically, his mind still processing the events of the day. The food was standard military fare, but in his current state of exhaustion, it tasted remarkably good. As he ate, he jotted notes in his pilot's logbook, recording details of the mission while they remained fresh in his memory. The next morning arrived with the distinctive pattern of tropical rainfall, a heavy downpour that drummed against the corrugated metal roof of the barracks before stopping as suddenly as it had begun. Wilson had slept deeply despite the uncomfortable bunk, his body claiming the rest it desperately needed. By 5:30 he was awake and preparing for the journey back to Guadalcanal. His dress uniform had been pressed overnight, another small courtesy extended by the base personnel, who had clearly been informed of his accomplishment. At the operations building, he found Major Peterson already reviewing weather reports and communications from headquarters. "Morning, Lieutenant," Peterson greeted him. "Your transport is being prepared now. DC-3 cargo plane. Not exactly luxury accommodation, but it'll get you back to base." Wilson returned the greeting with the appropriate salute. "Any updates on Japanese activity in the area, sir?" "Nothing significant overnight," Peterson replied. "They've maintained radio silence across most frequencies since yesterday afternoon. Could be a strategic adjustment following your encounter." Captain Lewis joined them, carrying a sealed document case. "Your reconnaissance photographs and my preliminary analysis ready for transport," he announced. "Headquarters has been notified to expect these with the highest priority classification." Lewis handed a separate envelope directly to Wilson. "Your personal report, Lieutenant. Admiral Halsey's intelligence staff will want to debrief you immediately upon arrival." Wilson accepted the envelope, understanding its significance. His first-hand account of the Japanese fighter tactics, their response patterns, and the navigable canyon routes would provide valuable insights beyond what the photographs alone could convey. A communications officer interrupted with a message form. "Major, flash traffic from Guadalcanal. Priority 1. Peterson read the message, his expression darkening. "Japanese naval forces are on the move. Multiple ship contacts reported heading southeast from Bougainville." He looked up at Wilson. "Seems your photographs captured the preparations for an offensive operation. Intelligence estimates they'll be in strike position against our Guadalcanal installations within 24 hours. The implications were immediate and serious. Guadalcanal represented the furthest American advance into Japanese-controlled territory in the Solomon Islands. A successful Japanese naval attack could threaten the entire Allied position in the region. "Your transport has been upgraded to priority status," Peterson continued. "You'll be wheels up in 15 minutes. Those photographs and your report need to reach headquarters immediately." Wilson nodded, understanding that the strategic situation had just elevated his mission's importance even further. What had begun as a routine reconnaissance flight was now directly connected to an imminent Japanese offensive. As predicted, within 15 minutes, Wilson found himself aboard a Douglas DC-3 transport aircraft, strapped into a canvas seat alongside the cargo compartment. Two other passengers, a wounded Marine officer being evacuated for medical treatment, and a naval communications specialist, occupied seats across from him. The DC-3's engines roared to life, and the transport began its takeoff roll along Outpost Victor's crewed runway. Wilson watched through a small window as the jungle fell away beneath them, the aircraft banking southward toward Guadalcanal, 130 miles distant. The naval officer, noticing the reconnaissance photographs case secured beside Wilson, attempted conversation. "Important mission?" Wilson nodded non-committally. "Just routine reconnaissance." The officer seemed unconvinced but respected the obvious security implications. "Heard some scuttlebutt about a pilot who took on an entire Japanese squadron yesterday. Any truth to that? I couldn't say, Wilson replied diplomatically. Rumors tend to grow with each telling. The officer grinned. Fair enough. Still, makes for a good story. As the transport aircraft continued southward, Wilson found himself reflecting on the events that had placed him in this position. His path to becoming a fighter pilot had been anything but straightforward. Born in Montgomery, Alabama in 1917, Wilson had been fascinated with aviation since childhood. His father, a mathematics teacher at a local school for black students, had encouraged his interest, scraping together enough money to purchase aviation magazines and books despite their limited means. When war came to America in December 1941, Wilson had already earned his civilian pilot's license through a civilian program at Tuskegee Institute, one of the few places where black Americans could receive flight training. The formation of the first African-American military aviation program had given him the opportunity he'd been waiting for. The training at Tuskegee Army Airfield had been rigorous and unforgiving. Instructors, both white and black, had pushed the cadets to standards exceeding those of regular Army Air Forces training, knowing that any failure would be used as evidence that black pilots couldn't handle combat operations. Wilson had graduated in the top 5% of his class, earning his wings and commission as a second lieutenant in October 1942. 4 months later, he had been assigned to the Pacific Theater, an unusual posting as most Tuskegee airmen were being sent to North Africa and Europe. The decision to send him to the Pacific had been explained as operational necessity. The theater was desperately short of experienced reconnaissance pilots. In reality, as Wilson later discovered, it had been the result of a personnel officer's error, confusing his file with that of another pilot. By the time the mistake was discovered, Wilson had already proven himself exceptional at reconnaissance operations, and his commander had refused to approve a transfer. That administrative error had placed him in the cockpit of a P-40 over Bougainville yesterday, facing odds that should have been insurmountable. Now it had him carrying intelligence that might prove crucial to the defense of Allied positions throughout the Solomon Islands. The DC-3 landed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal shortly before 900 hours. As the transport taxied toward the operations area, Wilson could see the heightened activity across the base, clear indications that the intelligence about imminent Japanese naval movements had already reached headquarters through other channels. A staff car was waiting as Wilson descended from the aircraft, a naval aide standing beside it at attention. "Lieutenant Wilson, Admiral Halsey's staff is waiting for your debriefing, sir. I'm to escort you directly to headquarters." Wilson collected the document case containing the reconnaissance photographs and followed the aide to the waiting vehicle. As they drove through the base, he noted the increased defensive preparations underway, additional ammunition being delivered to anti-aircraft positions, aircraft being armed and fueled, personnel moving with the unmistakable urgency of imminent operations. At headquarters, a reinforced concrete structure set into a hillside for protection against Japanese air attacks, Wilson was led immediately to a secure briefing room. Inside, he found an assembly of senior officers gathered around a large table covered with maps. Rear Admiral Wilson Brown, Halsey's chief intelligence officer, looked up as Wilson entered. "Lieutenant Wilson, we've been expecting you. Those the reconnaissance photographs from yesterday's mission." Wilson placed the document case on the table. "Yes, sir," along with Captain Lewis's preliminary analysis from Outpost Victor. As the intelligence staff opened the case and began examining the photographs, Admiral Brown turned his attention directly to Wilson. "I understand you encountered significant Japanese air opposition during your mission." "Yes, sir. Approximately 30 Zeros operating in a coordinated patrol pattern over the central Bougainville region. They appeared to be specifically tasked with intercepting reconnaissance aircraft." A murmur ran through the assembled officers. 30 fighters represented a substantial commitment of Japanese air resources in a theater where they were increasingly constrained by logistics and attrition. Wilson proceeded to deliver a concise but comprehensive briefing on his encounter, describing the Japanese formation patterns, their tactics during pursuit, and his observations about their operational limitations in the canyon environment. He explained his inverted flying technique and the unexpected consequences for the pursuing Japanese aircraft. The room fell silent as he described his navigation through the Needle, the narrow canyon passage that intelligence had previously deemed impassable to aircraft. "You're absolutely certain of the passability of this route?" Admiral Brown asked. "Yes, sir, under specific conditions," Wilson replied. "A single-engine fighter can navigate the entire length if the pilot is precisely aware of the terrain features. I would not recommend attempting it without prior study of detailed topographical maps, and even then, only in emergency situations." One of the intelligence officers spoke up. "This alternate route could prove invaluable for future reconnaissance missions, especially given the increased Japanese air patrols." Admiral Brown nodded thoughtfully. "Lieutenant Wilson, I want you to work with Captain Harrington here to document every aspect of this route. Measurements, visual landmarks, approach vectors, everything another pilot would need to navigate it successfully." "Yes, sir," Wilson acknowledged. The briefing continued for another hour as the intelligence team correlated Wilson's photographs with existing information about Japanese naval deployments. The emerging picture confirmed their worst fears. A major Japanese naval thrust toward Guadalcanal appeared imminent. As the session concluded, Admiral Brown addressed Wilson directly. "Lieutenant, your reconnaissance mission has provided critical intelligence that may well save hundreds of American lives. The information you've delivered, combined with your innovative escape tactics, represents the highest traditions of the United States Army Air Forces." Wilson stood at attention, receiving the Admiral's commendation with appropriate military decorum. "Thank you, sir. I was simply completing my assigned mission." "Nevertheless," Brown continued, "I'll be recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross based on your actions yesterday. Your performance under extreme circumstances was exemplary." After the briefing, Wilson was escorted to the officers' quarters to rest before his detailed debriefing with the intelligence staff later that day. As he walked across the base, he noticed several pilots gathered near the flight line, examining a map spread across the hood of a jeep. One of them, Captain Michael Reynolds, whom Wilson recognized from previous missions, spotted him and waved him over. "Wilson, just the man we wanted to see," Reynolds called out. "We heard about your canyon flying yesterday. The whole base is talking about it." Wilson approached the group cautiously, uncertain how his fellow pilots would react to his sudden notoriety. He had experienced varying degrees of acceptance since joining the squadron. Some pilots had welcomed him immediately based on his skills, while others had maintained their distance, uncomfortable with the integration of a black pilot into their previously all-white unit. To his surprise, the gathered pilots greeted him with genuine respect. "Is it true you flew upside down through the Devil's Backbone turn?" asked Lieutenant James Morrison, using the pilot's nickname for the canyon's most challenging section. Wilson nodded. "It was the only way to maintain speed through that turn radius." "And the Zeros tried to follow you?" asked another pilot. "4 of them entered the canyon behind me," Wilson confirmed. "Their aircraft couldn't handle the negative G loads in that configuration." Captain Reynolds shook his head in amazement. "Textbook example of using your aircraft's strengths against the enemy's weaknesses, and finding the Needle passage. Intelligence had that marked as impassable." "It very nearly is," Wilson admitted, 70 feet across at the widest point. The pilots exchanged glances of professional appreciation. In the meritocracy of combat aviation, skill and courage ultimately mattered more than background or skin color. Wilson had demonstrated both in abundance. "We're planning a reconnaissance sweep for tomorrow," Reynolds explained, pointing to the map. "High probability of encountering those same Japanese patrols. Any insights you can share would be appreciated." For the next 20 minutes, Wilson detailed the Japanese patrol patterns, their formation tendencies, and the tactics that had proven effective against them. The other pilots listened attentively, asking specific questions about altitudes, timing, and maneuver characteristics. As the impromptu briefing concluded, Reynolds extended his hand to Wilson. "Thanks. This information might make the difference tomorrow." Wilson shook the offered hand, recognizing the significance of the gesture. "Good hunting, gentlemen. The canyon approach works, but I wouldn't recommend it unless absolutely necessary." Later that evening, as Wilson completed his detailed debriefing with the intelligence staff, news arrived that American patrol aircraft had spotted the Japanese naval force southeast of Bougainville, exactly where Wilson's reconnaissance photographs had suggested they would be headed. American aircraft were already being dispatched to intercept. The intelligence officer, Captain Harrington, shared this update with Wilson as they finished documenting the canyon routes. "Your mission might have given us the advance warning we needed. Admiral Halsey has ordered a carrier strike group to intercept the Japanese force before they can reach striking distance of our positions." 2 days later, Wilson stood on the flight line at Henderson Field, watching as aircraft returned from operations against the Japanese naval group. The engagement had been decisive. 3 Japanese ships confirmed sunk, including a light cruiser, and several others damaged. American losses had been comparatively light: 4 aircraft and 2 pilots. Major Thomas Hartford, Wilson's squadron commander who had authorized his original reconnaissance mission, approached as the last aircraft landed. "Excellent work out there, Lieutenant," Hartford said, observing the returning planes. "I've just received orders from headquarters. You're being temporarily reassigned to the intelligence section to help develop new reconnaissance routes based on your canyon experience." Wilson acknowledged the assignment with a crisp, "Yes, sir," though part of him would have preferred to return to active flight status immediately. As if reading his thoughts, Hartford added, "It's just for 2 weeks, Wilson. We need those routes documented properly, and you're the only one who's successfully navigated them. After that, you'll be back in the cockpit. In fact, I'm recommending you for flight leader on our next major reconnaissance operation." Flight leader, a position that would place Wilson in command of other pilots during missions, including those who had initially kept their distance from the squadron's only black aviator. The significance wasn't lost on either man. "Thank you, sir," Wilson replied. "I appreciate the opportunity." Hartford nodded, then added more quietly, "Your actions the other day? That's the kind of flying that changes perspectives, Wilson. Not just about enemy capabilities, but about who belongs in that cockpit." He gestured toward the flight line, where pilots of varying ranks and backgrounds worked alongside their aircraft. "Skill like yours transcends everything else." 1 week later, the intelligence section completed its comprehensive mapping of the Bougainville Canyon system, including the previously undocumented passage Wilson had named the Needle. The resulting navigation charts would be used by dozens of pilots in subsequent months, saving countless lives as the strategic situation in the Solomon Islands evolved. Wilson himself would fly 27 additional combat missions before the war's end, earning 2 more distinguished flying crosses and advancing to the rank of captain. His canyon maneuver would become part of training doctrine for pilots facing superior numbers of enemy aircraft in constrained terrain, though few would ever attempt the inverted canyon flying that had made it legendary. Years after the war, when military aviation was finally desegregated, Wilson would be invited to speak at the Air Force Academy about innovative tactics in asymmetric aerial combat. When asked by a cadet what had gone through his mind while flying inverted through the canyon with 30 enemy fighters in pursuit, his answer captured the essence of his character. "I wasn't thinking about making history or defying expectations," he told the assembled cadets. "I was simply using every capability of my aircraft and every bit of knowledge I possessed to complete my mission and return home." Sometimes that's all any of us can do: use what we have where we are to accomplish what must be done. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.